Good morning. Hi. Welcome to the 16th Annual Africa Business Conference. My name is Amaka Ogier, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the conference this year.
And my name is Moses Asama. I'm the other co-chair for the conference this year.
We're incredibly excited to have you here. Our theme this year is Africa Accelerates, Equipping a Vibrant African Economy. This reflects the need for Africa to change its growth and now focus on inclusive growth and human capital development. To kick off this morning, we have Professor Catherine Duggan, who will give us an enlivening welcome address.
And I have the distinct honor of actually introducing Professor Catherine Duggan and tell you a little bit about our professor. So Professor Catherine Duggan is actually an assistant professor here at Harvard Business School, where she teaches in the Business, Government, and International Economy course within HBS here. She is a leading thought, I would say in HBS, the leading thought on Africa, business on the African continent here at HBS. And she's authored several cases, including one of the most popular ones, Nigeria, a crisis, opportunity and crisis, and including cases on Uganda as well. And so we're excited to have her here today and really be able to kick off the event and start a great conversation that we hope to be happening this weekend. So please, with all ado, Professor Catherine Duggan.
Thank you. Welcome. So thank you for joining us all on this very cold morning. I'm afraid we could not organize better weather for you, but it is lovely and warm in the glow of all of the excitement about this conference. I have to say, this conference, which I've done now for 6 or 7 years, is one of my favorite parts of this entire job. I love being on the HBS campus at a moment when we bring in so many young and excited people who are African and interested in Africa, sit down and talk very seriously about where the continent is and where the continent is going. So this is something that I would like to start with. We've talked about human capital development. We've talked about Africa accelerating. Today, I want to talk about youth. I want to include all of you, no matter who you are, in this category of youth. The youth of Africa are going to drive it forward, and the youth of Africa are going to be the place where we get the new ideas, where we get the new energy. Just to give you a sort of a sense of how important youth is to Africa and how important African youth is to the global economy in the next 40 or 50 years, I'm going to show you a few demographics here. On the left is Japan. You can see Japan's population is not a pyramid anymore. Japan does not have the kind of youth available to it to drive forward energy, entrepreneurship, and even the simple demographic needs that every country has. In the middle is Mexico. Mexico is a developing country, but they also are beginning to face population pressures in this direction. On the right is Nigeria. All of us understand the vibrancy of the youth in Nigeria. And we also understand the fact that the youth in Nigeria and across the continent need to be given a way to channel their energy. Not only do we need training, not only do we need inspiration, not only do we need stories told about the people who have come up with new ideas, who are really driving things forward, like William Kapwamba, who created, from writing these books, I'm sure all of you have heard of him, he's spoken in a number of TED Talks and other places. He thought to himself, I have a problem in my village, how do I solve it? He read a number of books, and he put together windmills himself, based on all of these books that he was reading, to solve this energy problem for his village. This is the sort of energy, this is the sort of creativity that comes from young and driven minds. And it's exactly the sort of story that is going on all over the continent and that we do not hear enough of. We do not hear enough about the young entrepreneurs who are really making a difference, like these women in South Africa, who are extremely good at business, even though they do not have MBAs, and in most cases, they don't have university degrees of any kind. They are driving forward the way business works in Africa. But it's also important that we understand that young people of all development, or young people at all human development levels also need to they need to have places to go to learn more at all levels. So people need to have places to go to learn basic human capital development questions and also to do things like take MBAs and beyond. So it's these people who understand some of the things that are going on in Africa, some of the real opportunities in Africa for business and for the youth, for the people to push things forward. It's people like the people sitting in this room who are going to come up with the ideas that are going to drive not just the private sector forward and not just the public sector forward on the continent, but who are going to drive everything forward into the future, to come up with new and vibrant ideas, new entrepreneurial ideas, and new notions about what could be, both in business and everywhere else. Now, here's a bit of a problem with that sort of mindset. I love the energy, I love the entrepreneurship, I love the notion that we can do something right now and very quickly. But a friend of mine has the following joke, which I love. He says, Nelson Mandela wrote this book, which was called The Long Walk to Freedom. But nowadays, the youth, not just in Africa, but particularly in Africa, the youth around the world do not want a long walk to freedom. They want a quick sprint to wealth. One of the things about being young is you want things to happen right now. You don't think about what's going to happen in the next 30 years. You think about what's going to happen by the time you're 30. And so there's, at the same time, there's this vibrancy, but there's also an impatience. One of the things that I'd like to encourage you to do is not just to think about what you're going to do next year, not just think about what's going to happen on the continent in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, but to take a really long-term view. Because it's your vibrancy and your energy which is going to build things in the long term, but you have to think in a more long-term way. So let me show you a couple of things. So first of all, this is the Porsche dealership in Lagos as an illustration of this interest in the sprint to wealth. But here I wanted to show you this graph, which shows GDP per capita in Nigeria, India, and China from 1960 to 1980. In 1960, when my family actually first went to Nigeria, it was a very exciting place to go. It was, in a way, almost like the Silicon Valley of emerging markets. If you were young, if you were excited about being in the place which was the next big thing, you went to Africa. You didn't go to India, you didn't go to China, you went to Africa. The problem is, in Nigeria, what we've seen is not very much growth between 1960 and 2007. This line is not only flat, but in real terms it means that people in 2007 are not much better off in Nigeria than their parents were, than their grandparents were. In China, we've seen tremendous growth. And people often say things like, why is it, or how is it, that a country like Nigeria, that a country like Malawi, that a country like Uganda can grow like China, like Singapore, like some of these other Asian miracles? Well, the first thing I'd like to say is we don't actually know the end of this China story. And China is not necessarily growing in a way that's sustainable in the long term. India, for example, is in the middle. And you can sort of think of this maybe as a kind of a three bears story with Goldilocks, right? One of the lines goes very, very fast and very, very quickly up. And yet, what's going to happen as China becomes more corrupt? What's going to happen as more and more of these unaddressed social tensions come to the fore? We do not yet know what's going to happen in China, and it could all come crashing down. Obviously, a relatively flat line is also not what we want in terms of growth. But maybe this more moderate, less efficient growth, but perhaps more stable and more democratic growth is a reasonable thing to talk about, this India model. And yet, I'd like to look at this graph, but I would like to caution you not to look for an Africa model in this graph. I would like to ask you not to cast around and say, is it Singapore that will work for Africa? Is it Lee Kuan Yew that will work for Africa? Is it China? Is it India that will work for Africa? Because none of those models will work for Africa. Africa has to find its own models, and those models of growth, democracy, development, and an understanding of how to make things like government legitimate, make things feel fair, make things feel as though they're moving in the right direction, and can channel Africa's tremendous energy. Those models have to come from Africans. They have to come from people who understand what the problems are, who understand what some of the solutions can be, and who are some of the most creative people in the world, in some cases working with the fewest things in the world. So let's go back. China, by the way, in case you're interested in China's demographics, China is going to face a real demographic problem in the future too. So if we imagine that the future of growth and development, and the future of ideas, comes from young people, it's Africa where these new ideas are going to come from. And Africa's youth can drive ideas into the rest of the world from these really creative and very young people. So let's take a long step back. Nelson Mandela, in 1937, was about 19 years old. This is a picture of Nelson Mandela at 19. I'd like you to imagine for a moment the world through a 19-year-old Nelson Mandela's eyes. What did it look like to grow up under these circumstances in South Africa? What could he expect? What did he think his life was going to look like at the end of his life? He could not possibly have imagined what was in store for him, what was in store for his country, or what he was going to do for his country over the course of his life. To move away from South Africa for a minute, 20 years after this picture was taken, when Nelson Mandela was almost middle-aged, people still thought that it made sense for people in hats like the one on the left to rule over people in hats like the one on the right. This doesn't make any sense at all. And children in South Africa in the 1960s still did not have a sense of what might be to come. This is one of my favorite pictures ever. It's a small child in South Africa sitting in a school. He is trying hard. There are beads of sweat that are coming down his face. He is working hard, but he does not know what for. He's working for some intangible future, because this boy in the 1960s could not have imagined that he would be able to live up to his full potential. There were rules and institutions that actually prohibited him from being as much as he could be. And yet, children of this generation, children who grew up at the same time as Nelson Mandela, people who were Nelson Mandela's age, and Nelson Mandela himself, changed that entire system. And children who sat on the floor and worked hard in schools with no heat and no electricity, and teachers who did not know what was coming next. Children who worked hard just because they thought they should, not because they thought that they could be president. Those children ended up being president. They ended up being the people who built the country, and who built a new country that many people said could not be built and would not succeed. I think this should be our inspiration. We do not need to know exactly where we're going. We do not need to be able to find an existing model or to draw a line from where we are today to where we would like to be in 2050. What we need to do now is to understand, first of all, that there is tremendous opportunity and that there's tremendous promise. And secondly, we need to understand that road to exercising that promise and that opportunity is not easy. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be short. It's going to require every single one of you to put in tremendous work, to bang your heads against more walls than you've ever seen. And the payoff is potentially bigger than you can possibly imagine. Not only more work than you can imagine, but better payoff than you can imagine. And that's the story of this picture. So let's go back to Nelson Mandela. Think for a moment about Nelson Mandela at 19, and think for a moment about Nelson Mandela last year. Unfortunately, we lost this great man. but imagine how satisfying a life that must have been to live. Imagine at the moment of the end of your life, when you take your last breath, what is it that you have contributed to the world? Not how much money did you make, not what positions did you have, not how many Twitter followers did you have, or whatever comes after Twitter. What contribution did you make, and do you have any regrets? I would suggest that the way not only to live your own life, but the way to really contribute to the growth in the continent, the way to push things forward, is to think to yourself, how can I live a life which will make the biggest difference and make sure that I have the fewest regrets at the moment when I take my last breath? Think to yourself, what is it that I want to be able to do? What is it that I want to be able to contribute? And what is it that I can still do? Every single person in this room is young. I don't care how old you are. Every single person in this room has vibrancy and energy and can really think to themselves, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? For those of you who are genuinely young in this room, your job is to have the energy, to have the sort of inspiration, and to make people like me want to get up in the morning and talk to you and ask you, what are you doing? What are you thinking about? What new ideas do you have? For those of you like me in the room who are a little bit older, your job is to provide guidance, to take this energy from people, but also to warn people about the challenges ahead, to tell them the challenges that you faced and how you dealt with them. Not because they're going to deal with them in the same way, but because we can all learn from other people's experiences. And for some of the people in the room who are perhaps a few years older than me, you have wisdom that none of the rest of us have. And you have seen more things than anybody else in this room has seen. And you understand some of the problems that can happen, but you've also seen tremendous and exciting things in your life. And you can provide the inspiration to the rest of us when things get hard, the understanding of history, but also the understanding of what's to come, and the fact that no one can adequately anticipate what's going to happen in their lives or in the world. So, let me end with a final quote from Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela said, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead." That doesn't mean that you can't go out and do business. Actually, quite the opposite. Africa is going to be, in my opinion, Africa is going to be driven forward by the private sector, by individual effort. It does not mean that you cannot make money. It does not mean that you cannot have a comfortable life. It does not mean that you cannot succeed in the ways that you want to succeed. What it does mean is, number one, you have to think about the gains that are going to last, not just about the gains that are going to come immediately. And number two, you have to think to yourself, how do the gains that I'm making contribute to these overall gains? And if we can all think that way, if we can all coordinate on making sure that we are building something together, then the thing that we have built will not only last, not only be stronger, but it will be bigger, better, and more satisfying for all of us at that moment when we are lying on our deathbeds, taking our last breath, and thinking to ourselves, I am happy with what I did with my life. So with that, on a positive note, I hope, thank you very much. It's terrific to see you all here.